Sandhell in his youth, he was involved in the coastal trade, missed the Battle of Stonington because he was running the British blockade at the time. And then in the years following the War of 1812, he continued in the coastal trade until the summer of 1819, when he came back, having sailed with his uncle, Peleg Brown. He returned to find that the brig Hercelia, 68 feet in length, was fitting out for a voyage to the deep South Atlantic, to Antarctic waters. The problem was that it was departing only 2 days after he got back home, but he was sort of buttonholed, I suppose, by Captain James Pendleton Sheffield, who said that he wanted young Nat Palmer to go on this voyage, not just as a crew member, but as second mate. So Mr. Palmer he would be, and he decided that this vessel, which was owned by 8 different members of the local community, and with 20 souls on board, Nat Palmer, being an energetic young fellow, decided that he would take this opportunity. And so he signs on with Captain Sheffield aboard Hercelia, and they head south. And this is what they're looking for. They're looking for fur seals and their valuable skins. And I'll talk about this endeavor in a moment. They head south down across the North Atlantic into the South Atlantic, keep on going down until they reach the Falkland Islands. And here we see the Falklands with, I can use this, my pointer here. They come into Berkeley Sound. Maybe you can see me kind of pointing that out here in the upper right-hand side. And in Berkeley Sound, they haul in for a little bit and they drop Palmer off along with 2 of the crew aboard on a little island called Kidney Island. And he and his men are there, left behind, the 3 of them, and their task is to find provisions. And those provisions would be cattle that had been colonized by earlier Europeans sailing through, and seabird eggs. So the Hercelia leaves them and goes sailing to the east. Hercelia is looking for another group of islands, the Aurora Islands. So Palmer's task is to have these 2 men and he gather as much beef and as many eggs as they can. So they're on the island, and after about a month, another vessel sails in. It has a strange rig, but this is the way it would look. This is the Espirito Santo out of Buenos Aires. Palmer speaks with the officers on board, and they contract with him to provision the Espirito Santo. And so he does. Again, beef and eggs. There was plenty to go around. But as he does, he becomes chums with the first mate on board, and he learns from them that they are bound to what becomes known as the South Shetland Islands. Islands further south and to the west that have fur seal rookeries. Off goes the Espirito Santo, and then the Hercelia returns. It turns out that there were no Aurora Islands. She was out there sailing in circles to no avail. And eventually comes back, picks up Palmer and his 2 men. And Palmer, of course, reports to Captain Sheffield that he's learned about this other group of islands. And so they head south on January 18th, 1820. They sight the first of those islands down here. And here's a map of the South Shetlands. They pull into Rugged Island, or Ragged Island, as it's sometimes called. And as they drop the hook, drop the anchor, they do so in 8 fathoms of water with a sandy bottom. And there, just across the bay, is the Espirito Santo. And I can only assume that the crew on board was not particularly happy that these Yankees had shown up, but there they are. And so the crew goes about its business of getting on shore and harvesting fur seals. This is a very unpleasant business. So what you would do is you would find herds of seals lying on the beach. Very simple process to walk up to them, whack them on the head and kill them, and then strip them of their pelts. And that's what they did to hundreds and thousands of these animals there down in the South Shetland Islands. A business that would horrify us today, and in fact, eventually horrified these Yankees and others as well. Not because they were butchering animals, that's what you did to survive in those days, but just the scale of the butchery. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So Hercilia is down there, but it's quite a productive operation. And by February 8th, only a matter of weeks, she sails out of Antarctic waters and heads home. She gets back to Stonington on the 21st of May, 1820. And this was the first American voyage to Antarctica. The brig Hercilia, Captain Sheffield and Palmer as second mate. The pelts are worth $22,000, which of course is a small fortune. And it's very good to be home. But the very next day, the man who organizes these efforts, William A. Fanning of Stonington, begins planning the next season's what he called South Seas concerns. So as soon as the money began to roll in, Fanning said, we're going to do this again when the seasons roll around and spring approaches in southern climes. That expedition would be much larger. The brig Hercilia went again as usual, but along with her were several other vessels. The schooner Free Gift, what would they call a tender schooner, she wouldn't hunt seals. She would help carry pelts and supply provisions to the men that were doing the hunting. The schooner Express, by the way, the Express was under Captain Ephraim Williams, a Stonington man. The Free Gift was up under Captain Thomas Dunbar of Westerly, certainly a local guy. We also had the brig Frederick under Captain Pendleton. And then the fifth of these vessels was the little 47-foot sloop Hero under now Captain Nathaniel Brown Palmer of the ripe old age of 20 years old. So these 5 vessels are organized to depart. Here we see the list of vessels. You can see their names there, the Frederick and the Express and the rest of them, with a total of 90 souls on board. Perhaps not 90, because when we look at the Hero at the bottom of the list, it lists 7 crew members. Actually, when she put to sea, there were only 5 on board. So I'm not sure how accurate those other numbers are as well, but somewhere approaching 90 men. Head to the South Shetland Islands, and as it says there, July 1820. Here's another document we can look at. That was an interesting document. This is the registration for the sloop Hero. She had been involved in the coastal trade, so she had a particular document for that. Just like if you're driving a car, you get a registration. If you're driving a truck, you get a different document. Well, in the maritime scene, if you're sailing in American waters, you get an enrollment. But if you're going to go far and you pay more, and you get a registration. So this is her registration. Can't see the fine print, but this is the official document that allowed her to leave American waters and head to the deep South Atlantic. Here's another very important document, the most important document. This is the logbook of the sloop Hero. Let me read this to you so you get a sense of how this thing is organized. It says the Seaman's Journal, and I'm trying to make out the small words there. I'll look at the screen actually, forgive me. A Seaman's Journal, and with easy and correct method of keeping the daily reckoning of a ship during a course of her voyage. And then down below we see it was sold by Mr. Burtis in New York City, and there's an image of a square rig ship. But if we open this up, by the way, the original log is in the Library of Congress. But here at here at Stonington Historical Society, in the Woolworth Library, we have a very good copy of it, a Xerox, and you can't miss a word, so it's really high quality. This is what this logbook looks like on the inside, and it's a classic logbook. This is the way they all look. And the idea is this is the legal document, the legal record of the voyage. If anything goes wrong, if there's any lawsuits, there's problems with cargo, whatever, it's all recorded here. We can see the columns down the left, the hour of the day from 1 through 24, actually 1 through 12, and then 1 through 12 again. And hour 1 begins at noon at the meridian. So your time at sea is different than our time ashore. And I'll explain that a little bit further, but we can see at hours 1, 2, and 3-ish, they were doing 7 knots. Hours 3-ish, 4, 5, they're slowing down to 5 knots, then 4 knots up until midnight, and then just rolling along so slowly at 1 knot, 2 knots. So that third column is for speed, and then the course you can see south of east and then south and east on this particular day. The winds coming out of the northwest, and then you can see the larger space on the right for remarks. You might talk about more information about the weather or current or other things that have happened that are going to affect the voyage. At the bottom, another column going across, and we can see, for instance, latitude and longitude. So you keep track. This is a ship's log, which is different than a ship's journal, because a journal is actually not the ship's. Journals are personal. And we have them here at the Woolworth Library, places like New Bedford Whaling Museum, Mystic Seaports, Blunt White Library have hundreds of these. And these are just wonderful documents, because it's not just the legal stuff, it's not just the data. Often the data is in there too, but these are much more personal. People's observations, people's feelings, particularly if it's a captain's wife on board. These things can be very, very informative, but much less formal. And what we find with the log of the hero is it sort of straddles these two worlds. That's kind of interesting. So here we see an image of the waters outside of Stonington. There at about 1 o'clock at the top of the image is Stonington Borough. You can see the word Stonington. And in the log of the sloop hero, it reads, July 31st, 1820, at 11 a.m. got underway and proceeded to sea. At meridian, at noon, cleared the reef, the Express and Hercilia in company. So 3 of them are leaving Stonington Harbor together. The reef, of course, is Watch Hill Reef, which runs from the end of Fisher's Island over there to Watch Hill Light. And once they clear the reef, they know they're in the open sea, and most of their worries, at least for the next several months, might be behind them. Open seas don't threaten a healthy vessel. What threatens a healthy vessel is hard stuff like rocks and islands and villages like Stonington. They'll wreck a ship any day. But they make their way out to sea, and he takes his sea time at meridian on July 31st. As he goes to sea in this vessel, this is a fine drawing of what we believe Hero looked like. There's no originals of her, but this is a good estimate by a curator at Mystic Seaport some years ago. As we look at this image, let's consider the crew on board. I mentioned that there were only 5, and that was the case. But to help us with that, I'm going to switch to this image. This is a famous American painting, John Singleton Copley. This is known as Watson and the Shark. This is America's first genre painting. Everything before this was portraits or religious imagery or something like that. This is the first action shot by an American painter. And it's got a great history. The poor fellow you see in the water is a fellow named James Watson. He's 14 years old. And what we're looking at is Havana Harbor. Watson, as a 14-year-old sailing out of England, was with his shipmates, and he went swimming in Havana Harbor, where he was attacked by a shark and lost his leg. Years later, he became very successful. In fact, the Lord Mayor of the city of London. Hard to beat that. So very wealthy, successful man. And he charged John Copley to paint this moment in his life that was transformative. And he was very careful to, he told Copley what happened and how it looked and all that, and Copley would sketch it out, and then he would say, no, you switch this, switch that. One of the things he told him was that man standing at the back wasn't a white guy. That man at the back, that shipmate of his, was a man of color. And so that's the way we see this painting. And we can use that to help us understand Palmer's crew. So I'm going to shrink this crew down. Sorry, Mr. Copley, Mr. Watson, but we're going to look at this version because there's only 5 people on board Hero. And here's who we have. Of course, Captain Palmer, 20 years old, and then first mate, Phineas Wilcox, another local man. He's 28 years old. So 8 years Palmer's senior, and Wilcox had been a captain in his own right. So that must have been an interesting dynamic. It certainly says a lot about what they thought about Palmer, giving him that responsibility. That's first mate, Wilcox. Second mate, Richard Fanning Loper, 2, again, very familiar Stonington names. He's 21 years old. And then there were 2 deckhands, Stanton Burdick, 16, and Peter Harvey, 31, of Philadelphia. Everyone on board is a local boy except for Peter Harvey, who was an African American. And he, like many thousands of other men of color here in America, went to sea. It was their best opportunity, equal work for equal pay. You're not the last hired and the first fired. You sign those ship's articles, you're on for the duration. And you have mobility, which was what most people of color in this nation never had. So here we have Peter Harvey representing thousands of others, and that's the crew of Hero. South they go. Not much happening. They stopped at the Falklands. They stopped at Staten Island up there near Cape Horn, and then continued south until they sighted the South Shetlands. And here's the journal entry for that day, November 12th, commenced with thick weather, fresh breeze from the north by east. Now, again, it commenced at noon. So at noon on the 12th, thick weather, pretty strong breeze. At 4 p.m., saw Castle Rock, stood in for Ragged Island. So Castle Rock, where's Castle Rock? Well, follow my little pointer here. There we are, Castle Rock, all the way down to the south and west of the South Shetland group. And they sighted that, but then they came in and moved up and found anchorage. You can see a little anchor there, anchorage here under Rugged Island, also known in time as Lloyd's Island. So he arrives. It turns out 3 of the other vessels are already there. The 4th one arrives the next day. And so the captains of the vessels are called together by the leader of the crew, and Palmer learns what's been going on. So they move over across to a more protected harbor, and everyone's doing well. And what Palmer finds out during these different meetings is that the free gift, that other schooner that's carrying supplies and such, had already gone exploring. It had come down a little bit. Find my pointer here if I can get that to show up again. There we go. Came down here into open water, and when sailing to the east, looking at these beaches to see if there's any seals, out past Deception Island, no seals. And then he comes back and reports back. Well, there's nobody here close by, nobody to hunt. So Palmer is given the task to go elsewhere. And what he's sent to do is to go south and see what's there. Islands, who knows? Nobody knew. And what I have up here are 2 images of different charts that were put together by 2 scholars that studied this historic voyage. The one on the left is done by a fellow named Thomas Stevens, a Connecticut historian. This was an article that he did for the Log of Mystic Seaport. And on the right is a fellow named Leonard Martin, did an article titled Antarctica Discovered by a Connecticut Yankee, Captain Nat Brown Palmer. And what we see are 2 perceptions of this voyage that are very similar, but they have a few differences. The most important thing that matches up is when Palmer goes right south, starts poking around the coast of the continent, and then right back north again. They disagree a little on the 2 different ends of this voyage, but they do agree on the basics of it. Here's another chart that shows the South Shetlands. Here, they're over in this neck of the woods. There's Deception Island, and then Palmer's going to come down this way in a very short while. So let's look at his journal. Wednesday, November 15th. These 24 hours commences with thick weather, a light breeze from the northwest. Got underway on a cruise, stood over for Deception, for the island. Course east for the North Head. So as I understand it, I agree with Thomas Stevens. He says sailing east, headed for the North Head. So he's looking for some point of land here in the north of Deception Island. Martin had him coming down here, but there's no North Head will be here. The North Head will be up here. And then he goes on to say that he runs into some heavy weather, and so he kind of eases out to the open sea. He gives himself some leeway, as they call it, some open space, and he goes north. Now, if he was down here, if he went north, he'd go right, into big trouble, those hard things called islands and rocks. So I believe he came around this way, like Stephen said, and he makes his way down, and he comes along the island, and he acknowledges in the log that they saw what we thought to be a harbor, lowered down the boat. and examined it. And of course, you don't, if you see what you think might be a harbor of refuge, you don't just go sailing in. You stand off where you're safe. You lower a boat and you have guys go in a small boat. If they run aground, no problem. Then they can come back and report. Well, they go on, and then he writes, an opening stood, all right, I'll say it again. An opening stood in, found it to be a spacious harbor with very deep water, 50 and 60 fathoms. Got out the boat to sound, found anchorage about 1.5 miles from the mouth. And what he's coming through, this opening is known as Neptune's Bellows. It's a very dynamic area, high rocks on either side. We can't see it here, but some very high pinnacles just underwater. It's a very dangerous entrance. But once you get in this harbor, it's beautiful. And here's why. This is why it's called Deception Island, because it's deceiving. Unless you find Neptune's Bellows right here, this very narrow opening, you think the whole thing is rock and cliff and snow and glacier. Here's the edge of a glacier. That's why it's so straight. But Palmer is the person that finds this opening. He sails in to what eventually becomes known as Whalers Cove right here. In he goes, and he's feeling pretty good. And then, well, let me just check my notes here because he adds a few things here. Okay, yes, here's what he adds. After he finds this good anchorage. At 11, we came in to 18 fathoms off the mouth of a lagoon, went on shore and got some eggs. And so they went on shore just in here, inside Whalers Cove. At least that's where we believe. And I'll show you some imagery of this. They go on shore, they find seafowl eggs, and that's all very good. But then he wants to a few more things. And where this arrow is pointing is what they call Neptune's window. And so he's interested in climbing up the hillside. So here's a picture from the beach. What we see here are water boats from later industrial efforts at the early 20th century left there to kind of rot on the beach. But as we can see, this is a black sand beach, and it's a black sand beach because this is a caldera. It's a volcano. In fact, Deception Island is still an active volcano. Again, as you heard, I was lucky enough to go on a voyage down there, an expedition in January. Things were quite quiet, but it's not at all difficult to get in there and dig a hole in the sand, and the water's so warm you can take a hot sauna in the sand there in Whalers Cove. We didn't have any of that, but that's okay. I don't need active volcanoes to make my day interesting. So here we are on this black sandy volcanic ash beach. And Palmer wants to go up to that gap there, that saddleback between the steep cliffs to see what he can see from there. This is what we believe he did. Here's the walk up. You go up across this sandy beach. By the way, there could be seals. If there'd been any fur seals, he'd have whacked them on the head, or his crew would have whacked them on the head, but no fur seals. They work their way up until they're here. And this is an image shot back in January from the top of what is known as Neptune's window. And Palmer looks out, as this photo is, to the south and the east, looking to see, are there islands? Do I want to go there? And what we understand, and things get a little hazy here, what we understand is that from up there at Neptune's window, off in the distance, he sees this, a precipitous, long coastline, could be an island, could be a series of islands. He doesn't know, but he does know if land's sticking up, there's probably beaches. And if there's beaches, there's a good chance there's seals. So he's looking out. And again, it's kind of uncertain exactly how this all came down. But one of the things his ancestors tell us is that Nat Palmer had very keen eyesight. And I'm not there to dispute that he did, but the claim is that he was able to see what we come to learn is the Antarctic continent from there. So Thursday, November 16th, here's what we find in the log. Commences with fresh breeze from the northwest and cloudy at 2 p.m. got underway. And it talks about all through this section how he's basically exploring the harbor, looking for better anchoring ground. Some's good, some's not good. But you don't just leave the best harbor in Antarctica without exploring it to see how you can use it to best advantage. And so that's what he's doing in the middle section of that log. But before he departs, let me put in a little aside for us here, because while he was there with his 4 crew, and amongst that crew was this object. This is known as a ditty box. Sailors, very typically, mariners of that day in the age of sail, had boxes or small bags in which they would keep their personal effects. It could be letters from home. It could be just all sorts of effects that remind them of home and that it's for their personal use. This is a ditty box, and I don't know if you can see very clearly, but on the left side, it has the letters SD, Stanton Burdick. Across the middle, Stonington, 1820, and on the right, Sloop Hero. This box went to Deception Island, and here we see it once again, 200 years later, almost at least, 200 years later at Deception Island, there in Whalers Cove, and it was brought by Mystic Seaport. Here we see Steve White in the back. There's his lovely wife, Maggie, in the front. And holding the box is one of Mystic Seaport's trustees. This is Alex Boulazel. And it was Alex's idea. He's been to Antarctica and the Arctic many, many times. And it was his idea some years ago to do this celebratory voyage in 2020 to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Palmer's voyage to this very spot. And Steve was able to convince the curators to trust him as CEO of Mystic Seaport to take this unique, valuable object back to waters that had sailed 2 centuries ago. It was an exciting moment, I'll tell you that. All right, let's jump back those 200 years to the voyage to Antarctica. So the 17th of November, these 24 hours commences with a fresh breeze. Again, it's noon on the 17th. From the southwest and pleasant at 8 p.m. It's nighttime, people. Who cares when you're a sailor? It's all about the tide and the wind. At 8 p.m., got over under the land, found the sea filled with immense icebergs. Hold on. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Let me correct that. Let's see. Icebergs at 12 hove to under the jib, laid off and on until morning. So they see icebergs. It's the dark of night. He shortened sail, only his jib. Those of you who are sailors know that that's the headsail there. So there's not a lot of canvas up. Standing off and on means you're tacking into the wind, you're tacking off the wind. You're basically holding your position. You're sort of hove to. Tacking off and on at 4 a.m. 4 a.m. people. Made sail. He said he was waiting until morning. So at 4 a.m. there's enough light, and it's now November 18th. Made sail inshore and discovered a strait tending south-southwest and north-northeast. It was literally filled with ice, and the shore inaccessible. We thought it not prudent to venture in. And so what this log tells us here is that he sails down toward Antarctica, and what he finds is that to his south and the west, that this is what he sees. This is what he beholds. And you certainly don't want to take a little 47-foot wooden vessel, any wooden vessel near this. This will just saw your hole in your hole right at the waterline and sink you. So it's prudent seamanship. Of course, that's the only way you survive in this business. Prudent seamanship tells him to move away. He spends some time looking along the coast, does not see any seals. His whole purpose is to discover seals, not continents. He's not an explorer. His job is to find product, no product. And so he goes on, thought it not prudent to venture in, so we bore away to the northward. And that's how he spends his time cruising around just on the edge of the continent. And then he goes on to say, commences with fine weather the next day. Light winds from the west-southwest. The middle part was pleasant. They hauled down the mainsail as they got up under Friesland, and I'll show you Friesland. They sailed back north. So here's the chart again. He comes south from Deception Island. He looks into Orleans Channel, and this is where all the ice is. He would love to go down there. I mean, that would get him behind Trinity Island. There's beaches here, there's beaches here. Well, actually, it's cliffs here, but too much ice. There's no way he's going to go there. So he makes his way off the coast, using his glass to look at the beach. If there's any fur seals, he'll see them. There's no question he'll discover them, but he sees nothing. And because of the threat there with those conditions, he heads back north, and he heads up to Friesland, which we now call Livingston Island, but this longest of the Shetlands, then known as Friesland, now known as Livingston Island. And he works his way up here to the north of it. And once he gets up here, he pokes around again, looking for good harbors. He's there to look for seals and look for safe places to carry on the business. And so the next days in the logbook, he talks about, won't go into the details, but he talks about sort of banging around up there in the channel. And then, in fact, finding some new harbors that are very good and very protective, till eventually all 5 vessels come back together. And that's really the story of his short voyage, but historic voyage to Antarctica. He was not the first to see Antarctica. The first to see, we'll talk about in a little bit, was a Russian explorer. The second, just a matter of perhaps days later, in January of 1820, we're here in November. In January of 1820, the British, with an imperial effort, and the Russians, with an imperial effort, observed the Antarctic continent. But here we are 10 months later, and it's a bunch of guys from Stonington that find Antarctica as well. So he's the 3rd human being to get down there, but certainly the first American. But he doesn't set foot because there's no seals to put your foot on the ground for anyway. So the other vessels all join him, and here we see a very high-tech imagery of those vessels together. And they go about their business again of harvesting seals. And again, it's a business that I think we would all have a very hard time with, but that was the nature of things. By mid-January, the take was such that Palmer was again sent down to look for rookeries. He's actually sent south this time. And here we see on this chart, he goes down along the coast of what we now call Palmerland, the Palmer Peninsula, around the islands, down, further south, to maybe it's 64 degrees south, maybe 68. By the way, on our voyage, we went this far south. The first thing we did, we came down out of Ushuaia and then just went down, past the Arctic Circle. Many of the people on board, the crew, the professionals, the expedition people, had never been this far south. They were thrilled to just get down here. And I'll talk about a little bit about that in a minute. But he goes down looking, how far down he got, we're not exactly sure, but somewhere down in this neck of the woods in Marguerite Bay. He comes back, he goes looking again. He gets sent out again, that's his job. And then he tells an amazing story later years, how in the first week of February, 1821, they've been down there for 3 months. He's out in a fog bank just south of Livingston Island, south of Friesland, looking around, but he's socked in, and he comes up it's 12:30 a.m., middle of the night. He rings the bell, the ship's bell. Many of you know that time is always worked out by bells. Midnight and noon is 8 bells. 12:30 a.m. or p.m. is 1 bell. 1 a.m. or p.m. is 2 bells, and it goes on. Every half hour you add a bell. Every 4 hours, then you get 8 bells. So he comes up at 12:30 a.m. and he rings the ship's bell once. Bang! And then amazingly, through the fog, he hears another bell. And then from the opposite direction, he hears a second bell. The crew is freaking out. These guys are sailors. They're a little superstitious. They don't know what's going on, nor does Palmer, until the fog rises. And when the fog rises, he discovers 2 Russian Navy vessels that have been sent down here, and they've been down here for months exploring Antarctica. And the person he goes to meet aboard his command vessel, the Rostock, is Fabian von Bellinghausen, who was a Russian naval officer and led this expedition that went from 1819 to 1821 in search of Terra Australis. Sir Francis Drake looked for Terra Australis. They called it Terra Incognito in those days. Everybody believed there was another continent down there, and so he was looking for it. His was the first to cross the Antarctic Circle since Captain Cook. Cook had actually done it back in 1773, but he'd never seen the land. So here's Bellinghausen actually circumnavigates the continent. So he was the first person to sight the Antarctic continent. Palmer goes on his vessel, and they have a conversation. According to Palmer, it was quite extraordinary, where this guy congratulates him on his wonderful accomplishment, this rough Yankee sailor doing as much as he could do for the Tsar with all of the Tsar's power. At least that's the way Palmer told the story. Bellinghausen's recollection is much less florid. But in any case, they do meet, and it was really quite extraordinary. Palmer goes on, and they keep hunting for seals. Here's another account from Nathaniel Palmer. This is the tally of men that took seals from boats. Remember, it's just like Fisher's Island Sound here. Everything's not a beach or mainland. There's also rock outcroppings. And just like we find here today in Fisher's Island Sound, seals will haul up on the rocks. And so they did here, and they would have to send small boats. You would row over to these rock outcroppings, and in the swell, you'd bump up against the rock. Somebody would jump off and start whacking seals on the head. And as the vessel, this little boat, 30-foot boat, 20-foot boats, rocking back and forth, you strip off the skins, you load the boat. And from that process, we see at the bottom almost 51,000 skins from the boats that Palmer records. Time to head home. And so they do. Here's the manifest. As he returns from Yankee Harbor, the harbor that he said, this is a good safe place for us people, over here by Livingston Island. He departs, heads back with 200 barrels of sea elephant oil. Something else you did while you're there is, if you could, you would kill sea elephants and boil out their blubber. They head back home, and the Hercelia goes on a different direction, but Palmer heads back, returns to Stonington on the 7th of May, 1821, and it's all been very successful. The horror is the amount of seals taken. 250,000 seals killed that season, 88,000 of them by Stonington vessels alone. So here we see the model of the little sloop hero, a heroic effort certainly, but one that gives us pause today. Of course, we're burning lots of carbon, so maybe we should look at ourselves as well. It was good to be home, back here in Stonington territory, but the song of the fur seal still called. And so what we find is the very next season, 6 vessels depart. Nat Palmer takes them down to Deception Island. He's now in charge of a vessel named the James Monroe. Along with him were several others, many of them vessels that had been on the first voyage. While they're down there this time, he gets sent away again, looking for new seal rookeries. In December of 1821, he's traveling in company with a British captain, a guy named George Powell, and they discover a new group of islands, which comes to be called the South Orkneys. So Powell and Palmer discover the South Orkneys. Powell goes on shore. He's fascinated by the geomorphology. Palmer never sets foot on land. Powell's a little frustrated. Why doesn't this Yankee come and explore with me? Well, Palmer's job was to find seals, not to go poking around to see if this is a volcano or whatever. And so Powell's a little frustrated, but Palmer goes on about his business. That season was a bust. They'd killed so many seals the couple of years before that it was just not worth the voyage down here. And they've determined that over 400,000 seals died as a result of harvesting or starvation. The adults are killed and the youth starve. The voyage comes to an end. It's not very successful. Palmer comes back and he doesn't go back to Antarctica. He spends the better part of the next decade sailing to the West Indies and places like Venezuela. But then in 1821, he returns to these deep Atlantic waters. He's now in command of the brig Anawan, and he's working with Benjamin Pendleton and several others, including his younger brother, Captain Alexander Palmer. And they all head down looking in these same waters. They don't find that there are many animals to harvest. So the voyage kind of breaks up. But Captain Alex had heard from Yankee whalers that there were islands to the west. There were no islands to the east of the Falklands, but there might be islands to the west of the Shetlands. And so the two Palmer brothers go sailing out there, and they bang around for most of February and March, which down there is getting into winter season. I know our expeditions we take down there for people to look at the wonders. You don't want to be down there come February. Middle of February, you want to be out of there. It's getting cold. He's down there through February and March, spending the better part of 6 weeks out in the open ocean to the west of the Shetlands, doing nothing but rolling and getting pounded and getting beaten. The vessels are worn out, the crews are worn out. And to make things even more interesting, Palmer had brought along his 19-year-old wife. This is Eliza Palmer, by the way. This is a generic silhouette, but it represents 19-year-old Eliza Palmer getting tossed around week upon week. I just can't imagine the strength and the endurance of this woman or the men that she was with. Eventually, the Palmers throw in the towel, but that's not done. He's supposed to be making profit. He's heard that if he went up to the island of Juan Fernandez, it's a penal colony, but they had been taking seal skins there. So he goes up to that penal colony to buy seal skins. As he and a handful of men are rowing ashore through the harbor, there's a Spanish vessel sailing out, hollering at him, hollering. Turns out they're saying, the prisoners have taken over the island, don't go ashore. He doesn't hear them. They capture him. They almost kill him twice there on Juan Fernandez. And then eventually he convinces them that he can sail them to freedom on the mainland. He gets out aboard the vessel, can't get away, but he jumps on board. He tells Eliza, lock yourself in the closet in our cabin. Don't move, don't make a sound. The boat's load of prisoners come out. The scary thing here is, apparently for Palmer, they brought their women with them. There were women there, and that's a raucous crowd. They're cursing and hollering and drinking. Palmer has no authority over these people, but he stands at the rail of his vessel and he says, those women go back on shore. He knew if they came on board, they'd break into the cabin and discover his wife. He insists that they take the women back. The men acquiesce. He brings them on board and eventually sails them to the mainland. They get their freedom, such as it was, and he gets his. And he and Eliza and the rest make their way back. And with this, we have the last of Palmer's adventures to the deep South Seas and Arctic waters. Amazing accomplishments by all regards. And here we see a portrait of the man, 1840, and certainly well accomplished, with a future that was going to make him even more famous in time. But if we jump ahead to the present day, we don't forget Nathaniel Palmer, not just those of us in Stonington, but the U.S. Coast Guard remembers him with the icebreaker, Nathaniel B. Palmer. The United States Postal Service remembers him with a 25-cent stamp. And there we see the little sloop Hero. He's also remembered internationally with Palmer Station. Down here on the mainland, we actually were able to stop here and were very kindly treated by the staff in there. And I don't know if you can see the signs, but one points to Stonington. They point all around the world, but they definitely include Stonington. The bottom one actually is a little picture of Nat Palmer with the mileage up to Stonington, Connecticut. And another way we remember him is Stonington Island. We visited this island. It was for many years a research center. These are the remains of the building of the research center. But Stonington Island, named to honor the community that birthed Nathaniel Brown Palmer, a man whose accomplishments are myriad and something that of which we can all be proud. And with that, I'll say thank you very much.
Thank you, studio audience. I heard that clap. All right, so there are a couple questions for you in the chat here. Just a few. So let's see. Jeff Little is curious about how far off of Antarctica is Deception Island? Like how far would Nat have seen?
Um, of course, I'm not going to remember the miles, but it's enough that you actually, on a clear day, you can see the mainland. You're up pretty high when you're up there at Neptune's window. So I'm going to cop out and send you to Google Maps.
That's all right. His guess was about 50 miles.
Sounds fine. Sure, I'll take that.
Good. Okay. We had someone else asking about, let's see, what years the Martin and other Palmer charts were published.
Oh, yes. Let's see. I think the Thomas Stevens one was done in the 1960s. You can go on Mystic Seaport's website and go to their library webpage and type in Thomas Stevens' name to get the date on that and which journal it was in. The Martin article was just about the same time, but I can't remember precisely. If we can get that name, I'd be happy to look that up and get back to that individual. But it was around the same time, if I remember correctly.
Okay. If anyone else has questions, feel free to put them in the chat feature down here. So this is a Greg Pettis question, and Greg, you are correct. I'm going to read it. Is the Hero the same vessel that Jeremiah Holmes sailed during the War of 1812?
Good question, and that's a controversial question. I'll give you, was convinced that they were two different vessels. I never got to see his paper. So I don't know where his information, what sources he used, but again, he was a sharp character, wonderful human being who then passed away tragically not too many years later from cancer. So I can't answer that definitively. I know a person that I admired and trusted said they were two separate vessels. Most people think they were the same. I would love to be able to differentiate.
All right. Do you know how often Nat would have sailed with Eliza?
No, I don't. I'll tell you what, if I'd been Eliza, I'd have gone up there somewhere west of the Shetlands on a dark night and given him the pitch overboard. I just can't imagine. I can't imagine the strength of her. As you may know, those of you who saw my previous lecture, she died in 1872, and they're buried together here in the cemetery up near Route 1.
I do know that she accompanied him on at least one trip to China. I'm sorry about that, everybody. I just got kicked off of our own Zoom call. So thank you so much for joining. So that is coming up on Friday evening. You can get your tickets at granitetheater.com or on our events and programs calendar. So again, everybody, thanks so much for joining us tonight. We just had a little glitch at the end, so I'm disconnected from everyone, but if you can still hear me, thank you so much for tuning in. If you have extra questions or anything, you can send those to library@stoningtonhistory.org, and we will do our best to answer them. Thank you again for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.